Christmas is supposed to be a time of joy, isn't it? Twinkling lights, warm fires, the sound of carols drifting through the night. But what if it wasn't? What if the warmth you count on to fill your home was replaced by something colder than the winter outside? What if the laughter of your family faded into silence and the shadows on your walls began to move, just slightly out of sync with the light? What would you do if, as the frost crept over your windows, you realized it wasn't the weather at all, but something else? Something watching, waiting, and already inside? If you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for coming back. It means the world to me that you're here. And if this is your first time, welcome to the channel. I'd love to have you stick around, so feel free to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of the new stories we have coming your way. I'm so glad you're here. It started as the perfect winter evening. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, blanketing the small town in a stillness that only winter can bring. The streetlights cast a soft amber glow, their light reflecting off the frost-covered rooftops. Every home on Cedar Lane had its own touch of holiday magic. Wreaths hung neatly on front doors, strings of lights twinkled in rhythm, and the faint hum of Christmas carols echoed in the distance. Ours was no different. The house felt alive with the season. The scent of freshly baked gingerbread cookies lingered in the air. The fireplace crackled with a welcoming warmth, and the tree, tall, full, and meticulously decorated, stood proudly in the corner, its ornaments reflecting the soft glow of its multicolored lights. I remember feeling content as I sipped my hot cocoa, watching the snow pile higher against the windowsill. But then something shifted. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A slight chill in the room, though the fire was burning strong. The soft chime of a bell, distant and faint as if someone had passed by with a sleigh, or perhaps walked just close enough to our front porch to make the wind carry the sound. I told myself it was nothing. Snow has a way of playing tricks on the ears, doesn't it? But then there was the frost. It was cold outside, frigid even, but inside the windows seemed unnaturally frosted over, not the casual streaks of condensation that form when warm air meets cold glass. No, these were patterns, deliberate, swirling shapes that almost looked like letters. I remember wiping the window with my sleeve, watching the frost reform as if the glass itself was exhaling. And then came the shadows. Have you ever noticed something out of the corner of your eye? A movement, quick and fleeting, and you turn your head, but nothing's there? It started like that. Small, inconsequential. Just the play of light and imagination, I told myself. But the shadows didn't behave like they should. I'd see them stretch across the room, even though the lights were stationary. They moved, slow and deliberate, pooling in places where the corners of the house grew darker. That night, I went to bed with a strange unease, sitting heavy in my chest. I told myself it was exhaustion or maybe too much sugar from the cookies. Sleep would fix it. Sleep always does, right? Except it didn't. I woke to the sound of something faint, almost imperceptible. It wasn't a creak, not the groan of an old house settling in the cold. No, it was more rhythmic, like the muffled steps of someone walking across the snow-covered yard. I sat up, straining my ears to listen. Nothing, just silence. But as I laid back down, my breath caught. Across the room, in the faint light filtering through the curtains, I saw the mirror. It wasn't what was reflected in the mirror that froze me. It was what wasn't. The bed was there, the outline of my figure tucked beneath the covers, but the rest of the room, it didn't match. The shadows in the mirror twisted unnaturally, pooling around the corners of the reflection, but not in the room. I stared, unable to move, as one of the shadows grew larger, darker, spreading across the surface of the mirror until it was all I could see. I don't remember falling asleep or passing out. All I know is when I woke, the frost on the window had spread and there was a single handprint on the glass. A handprint larger than mine, pressed from the outside. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the bell. It rang again, louder this time, coming from inside the house. It wasn't Christmas anymore. The fire had gone out, the ornaments on the tree had fallen as if something had brushed against them, and the shadows, those twisting, reaching shadows, they were no longer hiding in the corners. They were waiting, watching, and closer than I could have imagined. The next day, I told myself it had been a dream, or maybe just the product of too much holiday stress, the planning, the decorating, the endless loop of Christmas music. I convinced myself of this as I went about my day, trying to bring some normalcy back into the house. But as I moved through the rooms, there was something wrong. Something I couldn't quite name. The air felt heavier, colder, even though the thermostat read the same as always. The Christmas tree lights, which had been bright and cheerful the night before, now seemed duller somehow, their colors muted. I chalked it up to old wiring, though I'd checked them only days earlier. It wasn't until I stepped into the living room that I noticed the mirror. It was just an old, gilded thing, something my grandmother had left me. I'd always thought it was beautiful in a classic sort of way, the kind of piece that anchors a room. But now it felt out of place. The surface wasn't smooth anymore. It looked rippled, like the reflection was being pulled beneath a layer of dark, swirling water. I stood there for a moment, staring at myself in that warped glass. And that's when I saw it. Not me exactly, but something behind me. A shape, tall, dark, motionless, hovering just beyond my shoulder. My heart jumped as I whipped around, expecting to find someone standing there. But there was nothing. When I looked back at the mirror, the shape was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, some weird illusion caused by the way the sunlight hit the glass. I had to believe that. Because the alternative, the idea that something had been there right behind me, was too much to accept. As the day wore on, the unease grew. Little things kept happening, small enough to dismiss if you were determined to keep a grasp on normalcy, but strange enough to stay with you. The ornaments on the tree began to sway gently, as if a breeze had passed through the room, though no windows were open. The sound of that bell returned, faint and distant at first, then closer, like it was moving from room to room. And then, that night, the frost came back. The windows were completely covered, so thick that no light from the street lamps outside could get through. I ran my fingers over the glass, expecting it to melt under the warmth of my touch, but it didn't. The frost was cold, bitterly cold, colder than the winter night outside. And in the center of the pane, there was that handprint again, impossibly large, pressed into the glass as though something, or someone, was standing just outside. I should have been terrified, and I was, but what scared me more was the sound. It was faint at first, a soft, low hum, almost like someone humming a Christmas carol just out of earshot. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was coming from outside, but as the minutes passed, it grew louder and closer. I followed the sound, my steps hesitant as I moved through the darkened house. The hum turned into a melody, one I recognized immediately, Silent Night. But there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't until I reached the basement door that I realized the music wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the melody stopped. Dead silence greeted me, thick and suffocating. My breath hung in the air as I peered down the stairs into the pitch-black void of the basement. "Hello?" I called, though I didn't expect an answer, and for a moment there wasn't one. Then, from the darkness, came the faint sound of footsteps. Not quick, scrambling steps, but slow, deliberate ones, each one heavier than the last, as though something was ascending the stairs. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The sound stopped on the other side, but I didn't stay to see what would happen next. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I, with that overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone? The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, their edges sharper, as though they were reaching for me. And in the quiet of the night, I could hear it again, that faint, melodic hum, drifting through the walls like a lullaby from something that didn't want me to rest. The next morning, I tried to go about my day as if everything was normal. I told myself it was all in my head, the product of an overactive imagination fueled by too many ghost stories and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was happening in that house, something I couldn't explain, and it wasn't going away. The frost was the first thing I noticed. It had spread overnight, not just on the windows, but on the inside walls. Thin, intricate patterns etched themselves across the paint, like frozen spider webs. When I ran my hand over them, the ice didn't melt. It stayed there, biting into my skin with a cold so sharp it made my fingers ache. And then there were the sounds. It started with the bell again, faint and distant, like it was playing hide and seek in the house. I would hear it upstairs when I was in the kitchen, then down in the basement when I moved to the living room. It was constant, always just far enough away to make me question if I'd really heard it. But by the afternoon, the sounds weren't just bells anymore. I was sitting in the living room trying to distract myself with a book when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling a loose shingle on the roof. But then it moved. The tapping began on the window to my left, then shifted to the one across the room. I stood up, my heart pounding, and as I turned toward the sound, it stopped. That's when I noticed the mirror. It was there as always, hanging above the fireplace, but something about it was wrong. The reflection didn't match the room. The tree was there, the couch, the fireplace, but the shadows in the mirror were deeper, darker. They moved in ways that didn't make sense, stretching and twisting as if they were alive. And then I saw it again, that shape, tall and dark, standing just at the edge of the frame. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew it was watching me. I could feel its gaze, heavy and cold, pressing against my chest like a weight. My throat tightened, and my legs felt like they'd turned to stone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into that mirror, but when I finally blinked, the shape was gone. The reflection was normal again, but the feeling didn't leave. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every little sound, every flicker of light. The house felt alive, but not in the warm, comforting way it had before. It felt aware. That night, I decided I needed to know what was happening. I went into the attic, a place I'd avoided since moving in. It was cold, far colder than the rest of the house, and the air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. As I rummaged through the boxes, my hands brushing against old ornaments and forgotten decorations, I found it. A small, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it carefully, the musty smell of old paper filling my nose. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, as if the person who'd written it had been in a hurry. The entries started out normal enough, mundane details about the weather, holiday plans, family gatherings. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. "The cold is worse tonight," one entry read. "No fire seems to warm the house, and the frost won't stop spreading. The shadows, they're moving again. I can feel them watching us." Another entry, dated just days before Christmas, was even worse. "Ethan says he saw a man in his room last night. He was cold to the touch," he said. "His breath fogged the air, even though the room was warm. I told him it was just a dream, but I don't think he believed me. I don't think I believe me." The last entry was short, scrawled so hurriedly it was barely legible. "It's here. I can hear the bells. God help us. It's inside." My hands trembled as I closed the journal, the words echoing in my mind. I wanted to run, to leave the house and never look back. But when I turned to go, I froze. The attic door was open, though I'd locked it behind me. And standing in the doorway, framed by the faint glow of the hallway light, was a shadow. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough to send a wave of cold through my body, freezing me in place. When I finally mustered the courage to step forward, the shadow was gone. But as I descended the stairs, I heard it again. That same haunting melody, faint and distant, drifting through the house like a warning. I knew then that whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop. It had been waiting, and now it was here. I tried to leave that night. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and threw open the front door without looking back. But when I stepped outside, the world had changed. The snow, which had been soft and powdery, was now frozen solid, reflecting the dim light of the moon like a sheet of glass. The air was colder than I'd ever felt, so cold it burned my skin. And the street was wrong. Where there should have been houses, rows of warm, inviting homes decorated with lights, there was nothing, just darkness. A black void stretching endlessly in every direction. The only thing that remained was my house, its windows glowing faintly as if mocking me for trying to leave. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot. When I turned, I saw it again, the handprint on the frosted glass, larger than before, its fingers longer, sharper. I didn't have a choice. I had to go back inside. The moment I stepped through the door, the house felt different. The warmth from the fireplace was gone, replaced by a bone-deep chill. The Christmas tree lights flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. And the sound of the bell, louder now, insistent, seemed to come from everywhere at once. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest until it led me back to the mirror. The surface of the glass was no longer smooth. It rippled and shimmered like water disturbed by a stone. And in its depths I saw them, figures, dozens of them, moving in the shadows. Their faces were indistinct, their features blurred, but their eyes burned with a cold, unnatural light. Then one of them stepped forward. It was the same figure I'd seen before, tall, dark, and impossibly still. But now it was closer. I could see its outline more clearly, its form shifting and bending as though it was made of smoke and ice. It raised a hand, long, skeletal fingers tipped with frost, and pressed it against the inside of the glass. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in a sound. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the air and into my bones. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but I understood it all the same. It was telling me that I had to stay, that I had been chosen. I stumbled back, my breath fogging the freezing air, and that's when I realized the frost wasn't just on the mirror anymore. It was spreading, crawling across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It reached the Christmas tree, and the ornaments began to crack and fall to the ground, shattering like glass. I ran. I don't know how I made it to the basement door, but I did. It was the only place left, the only place that felt quieter. I slammed the door behind me and descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was pitch black, but I could hear it, the hum, the bell, the faint, distorted melody of Silent Night. And then in the corner of the room, I saw it, an old, dust-covered record player, spinning slowly, its needle dragging across the vinyl. I don't remember that record player being there before. The bell rang again, louder this time, and the shadows in the basement began to shift. They poured down the walls, pooling on the floor, twisting and curling toward me like smoke. And then I saw the mirror. It was there in the corner, though I knew I hadn't brought it down. The surface was black now, completely opaque, and in its center was a single glowing light. It pulsed, growing brighter with each ring of the bell. I don't know what came over me, but I stepped closer. The cold was unbearable, my breath freezing in the air, but I couldn't stop myself. The light in the mirror grew brighter, and as I reached out, my reflection disappeared. Instead, I saw them, the figures, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressed against the glass, their faces contorted in silent screams. Their eyes locked onto mine, and I understood. They were trapped. The mirror wasn't a reflection, it was a prison. And now it wanted me. The light surged, blinding me, and the last thing I remember was the sound of that bell, piercing, deafening, and final. When I woke up, the house was silent. The frost was gone. The mirror was shattered, its shards scattered across the floor. But the bell? I still hear it sometimes, faint and distant, like a whisper from another world. And every Christmas, when the frost begins to creep across my windows, I wonder, did I really escape? Or is it just waiting for me to come back? After that night, I couldn't stay in the house. I packed what little I could, left the rest behind, and drove as far away as my tank of gas would take me. The snow was relentless, falling in thick, heavy sheets, but I didn't stop. I didn't care where I ended up, as long as it wasn't there. I found myself in a small motel just outside of town, the kind of place where the clerk doesn't ask too many questions. I paid in cash, locked the door behind me, and sat on the bed, staring at the wall until morning. But leaving didn't change anything. The frost followed me. At first it was subtle, a light dusting on the motel window when I woke up, though the room was warm. I told myself it was just the weather, that I was imagining things. But then I noticed the handprint. It was faint, barely visible in the morning light, but it was there. Larger than it should have been, the fingers long and thin pressed against the glass. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just paranoia, a lingering fear from the nightmare I'd lived through. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few days, the signs became harder to dismiss. The tapping on the windows returned, no matter where I went. The bell rang in the distance, growing louder each night, and the shadows, they started to move again. One morning, I woke to find a single shard of glass on the floor by my bed. It was small, jagged, and impossibly cold to the touch. I didn't bring it with me, I was sure of that. But there it was, a piece of the mirror I thought I'd left behind. I tried to throw it away. I wrapped it in a towel, buried it deep in the trash, and left the motel that same day. But the next morning it was back, sitting on the nightstand as if it had always been there. I realized then that I couldn't escape it. Whatever was in that house, whatever I had seen in that mirror, it wasn't bound to the walls or the frost-covered windows. It was bound to me. I don't know why it chose me, and I don't know what it wants. Maybe it's waiting for something. Maybe it's just watching, learning, biding its time. All I know is that every year as Christmas approaches, the frost begins to creep back into my life. The air feels colder, the nights grow longer, and that bell, faint, distant, and unrelenting, reminds me that I'm never truly alone. I've learned to live with it, in a way. I don't decorate for Christmas anymore. I don't light candles or string up lights, and I never, ever look into mirrors. But sometimes when the frost is thick and the shadows seem a little darker, I can feel it again, that presence, heavy and cold, just out of sight. And in those moments I wonder, am I still running? Or has it already caught me? Have you ever felt it? The chill that lingers just a little too long? The way shadows seem to stretch where they shouldn't? Or maybe you've heard the faint ring of a bell in the quiet of the night and told yourself it was nothing. If this story struck a nerve, if it made you question what might be waiting just out of sight, I want to hear from you. Share your experiences in the comments below. Hit the like button, share it with someone you know who loves a good scare, and don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories like this. Stories that will make you question what's lurking in the dark. And if you hear the bell, well, maybe it's already too late.